Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. Oh, by the way, we're well into our 72nd or 73rd show here, so it's quite an achievement, particularly bearing in mind that our producer tonight, Kevin Gibney, is still suffering from the after effects of COVID. And if this was an audience and we were live, I would ask you to give them all a round of applause. Since you can't do that, I'll assume that you've actually done so. Thank you. It's been another great day for British democracy. We hear that Michael Gove, that well-known friend of Scots everywhere, is to head up a new job of fixing food supplies ahead of Christmas. On hearing the news, most folks reckon that Christmas is pretty much cancelled now. That said, in fairness, knowing it's him, it might at least be snowy. Thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight, we are talking to Yes activist and all-round good chap, Mike Fenwick. And we'll be talking about the future of Scotland, the role perhaps of the United Nations, and so much more besides. And he's taking your questions live. If you want to send a question or comment, the details are on the What's On Guide at whatsonguide.scot. As you know, TNT stands for The Nation Talks. So, in many respects, this is your show. We're live and we're free. So, no license, no problem. Now to our guest. Tonight, The Nation talks to Mike Fenwick. Mike, how are you? How are you coping with the pandemic?
Hi, John. Good evening. I'm fine. Main problem we have is that our family is fairly well extended. Only one part of it in Scotland, one part of it in London, one part of it in France, and one part of it originally in Singapore, but now in Switzerland. And that, I think, is the main problem we suffered, is you can't see the grandchildren or the children as easily as in the past. And they're all growing up. We have a family WhatsApp group, and that just never stops with news from wherever it's coming from. So, sometimes funny, sometimes sad. A lot of it to do with food for some reason. I'm not quite sure why, but a lot of it to do with food.
Well, particularly when you've got young kids, it's sort of unavoidable to be talking about food because so much of their life revolves around either the input or the output of food in various forms.
Yeah. No, for personally and my wife, no problem whatsoever.
Now, you were telling me the last time we spoke that you were planning to go to London. Did you ever manage to do that?
Yeah, managed to go down and look after two. I keep saying two twins. That's four. It's not. It's twins. My daughter just had twins in addition to another son. So she now has three boys to cope with. And for a short period, my wife and I coped with them. Beautiful boys.
How old are they?
Months old, the twins, and coming up for 3 is the other boy.
Yeah. You hesitated slightly there, and it reminded me of an incident that involved the whole family. My son and his wife have, there was 3 kids. We were going through immigration, and the immigration officers looked across at us and said, "We're going to have some fun here." And he said to my son, "So just remind me the dates of births of all your children." And he was pretty close. We got November right, and well, when you're busy, you can't think about everything. Now, we were talking about earlier about James Hawes, who was on last week. Interesting guy. You've got some thoughts on what he was saying. What was it that struck you about his remarks?
There was 2 points I was going to pick up, John. Way back at the beginning of this year, I sat down and did some very deep thinking about independence and what could be done about it. And started doing something deliberately on the 6th of April to celebrate 1320. But what James Hawes was talking about, and 2 particular things completely chimed with me. First one was when he was talking about the reunification of Germany, East Germany and West Germany. and the fact that no one had predicted that was going to happen. And that's something I referred to in a live stream I did on Independence Live, which is big changes can happen for sometimes a very insignificant event, which it's only with hindsight you can look back and say that change, that is actually what changed history at that point. And when James was talking, the thing that came to me, which I've looked at, was what was called the Pan-European Picnic, which is when Hungary decided to test Russia, test Gorbachev, basically. And there was East Germans who came to Hungary to have a picnic in Hungary. And to keep it short, basically the gates to Austria were opened, and a few people went across into the West, and nothing happened from Russia. People were worried that East Germany would react badly, were worried that the hardliners in the Soviet would react badly. But that then became 100,000 people going through those gates. Subsequent to that, that's just a very, very simple thing. Someone opened the gates and saw what happened. So when we're talking about Scottish independence, I always see it, it's a very bad analogy I'm going to give you. It's like a bottle of champagne or a bottle of Prosecco. Before you take the cork out, there's just a huge amount of pressure within that container. That was what was happening in old Soviet Union, the pressure of people wanting their freedom, the right to have democratic elections, and the cork popped. And I see Scotland in a kind of similar way to that just now. Very simply, there are pressures building up, and it's looking for the opportunities to try and see what we can do to trigger different things happening, which maybe let the cork out the bottle and we regain our independence. The second thing was, and forgive me, John, I'm about to challenge you slightly. In the discussion with James Hawes, and I recommend anyone who has not watched that program, please watch it again. It's what Independence Live is there for. And John and James Hawes had a brilliant discussion. But at the very end, you started talking about choices of referendums and plebiscites and UDI. And at one point, John, forgive me for this, you said, and I assume you're not in favour of UDI, James. And he instantly said, no. I want to pick up on that because UDI is often seen as something that, let's dramatise it. Nicola Sturgeon's going to arrive just short of Carlisle and say, I've just declared independence. That's how we see it. It's a collective thing, authored by one person in Scotland's behalf. I see it an entirely different way. I'll try and explain why. Were there a referendum, we go along to the polling booth. We put an X in the box. We hope for yes. It's completely anonymous, John. No one will ever know. You will know. Your family, generations to come, will never see what your voice was actively saying at that point. Exactly the same with a plebiscite. You will go into a polling booth. No one will ever know how you voted. Why not? This is what I started thinking about at the beginning of the year. Put my hand up. I want to put my name to how I feel about independence. And thus was born what I call the Declaration of a Sovereign Scot. That ties in, you'll know I've already voiced this in our short chat we had, ties into the Declaration of our Growth in 1320. We celebrate that 700 years ago plus, John, and we celebrate it. Now, we celebrate it on the surface because of the words that were spoken. We can all quote them. For me, it's what they did rather than what they said. Because if they hadn't done what they did, we would, and someone kept a copy, thank goodness, we wouldn't have a declaration and the words in it. And that's, I think, everyone that's involved in the Yes movement have to think up ways of having a Yes legacy, same as the Declaration of Growth. For goodness sake, not let's, in the build up to us regaining independence, let's not leave anything unsaid, anything unshouted about what we want as a country, so that in future generations, maybe not 700 years from now, even 150 years from now, my twins from my daughter will be able to look back and say, that was our granddad on the John Drummond TNT show, and he did this thing about the Declaration. I originally started out only wanting 100 people. I wanted 100 dedicated people. I called it the first 100. The National picked up on it and said, could you make this open? And we did. We set up two links. One ties in with the United Nations, and we will come on to that. The other one was to the Declaration itself. Thankfully, a lot of people have begun to bite into that. And I'm just hoping it will get wider and wider. It's baby steps, John. I always believe in thinking big but starting small. It was my way of saying, I'm Mike Fenwick, whilst I have my feet on this planet, and the planet is here to have my feet on. I want to declare my independence. I don't need anyone else to do it for me. And if enough people did that, because at the end of the day, and I'll stoom in a minute, at the end of the day, that's what will happen in a referendum. It's what will happen in a plebiscite. It's an amalgamation of people all going in the same direction and saying the same thing. We don't need to wait for that to happen. We can actually do it now.
I think actually your argument might be strengthened, because I gather that there's some legislation at Westminster that would make any referendum that involved a change in the constitution of the UK only permissible if both houses agreed to it at Westminster, and by a particular proportion.
Yep.
In other words, the installation of specific hurdles. When I read it, first of all, it was rather infuriating. But then I realized it was a colossal own goal, because if you don't make it easy for people to express themselves, you effectively strengthen them. It's an odd thing. On the face of it, it looks like, oh, I'm in charge and I'm going to stop you doing something. But, something, as soon as I say these words, I've lost. I really have, because I've lost the moral argument, because I'm now using force. And as soon as you resort to force, it seems to me, in this case, not armed force, obviously legislative force, you sort of lose it, because at the same time, you have to argue that democracy in Scotland doesn't count as much as democracy elsewhere on this island. And it seems to me that gets you into all sorts of hot water, which you're best to try and avoid if you can. And it struck me that perhaps only this administration would have gone down that route. I think previous administrations would have avoided it like the plague, because they would have seen it as their own goal, and they would have said, that's the last thing we want to do. Because imagine there's lots of people say, typically when there's any secessionist or separatist movement, you get roughly a third split. I mean, I'm generalizing now, but, by and large. And the people who win are the people who, in whatever third they happen to occupy, manage to persuade enough of the people in the middle to support them and not to support the other lot. And it's as straightforward as that in some cases. All this sort of legislation does is drive people who are open-minded into the independence camp, because they're saying, well, I didn't perhaps quite agree with the SNP and all the other independence parties, perhaps, but now you're forcing me to make a choice.
It refers back to what I was talking about, the pressure building up and people recognising that. I mean, I know we'll come on to United Nations, but just as a simple example, Scottish Parliament decided it wanted to legislate and incorporate the UN Charter on the Rights of the Child. And immediately they did that. Westminster said, oh, no, you don't. And that takes me on to a broader subject about, if you like, international recognition. When I was talking about shouting, I think we need to tell the world these things are going on in the things that we're looking at. Section 30 is to do with the legality of international recognition. If you tie it into self-determination in the Charter from the UN, Very interesting point. A lot of people maybe don't know this, and it's a thing I think is very significant. UN Charter was done, as you know, just after the war. Do you know the first 3 words on that charter? It's not we the nations, it's not we the countries, it's we the people. And that takes you straight back to Scotland, and the people are sovereign, John. One of the things I worry about is we keep saying the people are sovereign, but we've got to find ways of letting people exercise that sovereignty. You can talk about street stalls, you can talk about marches, you can talk about a lot of other things, but there's got to be actually practical things. That's why I come back to the declaration as I described it. It's a practical action where I'm expressing my sovereignty. Involves 3 simple questions. And if you'll let me, I'll ask the 3 questions and see how you react to them. Number 1, do you consent to the continuation of the Treaty of Union? Very simple question, yes or no. Do you believe that the powers under the Scotland Act and the bits of legislation that have followed provide the Scottish Parliament with sufficient powers to ensure the welfare and the prosperity of the people of Scotland? The answer is no. And lastly, and I did this for 2 different reasons, or a double reason if you like, do you consent to the roads of Scotland and the waters of Scotland being the harbour for nuclear warheads? 3 simple things. Now, going back a long time ago, it shows my age, before Nicola Sturgeon, before Alex Salmond even, I used to sometimes bump into, because we both worked in Paisley, I used to bump into Gordon Wilson. Gordon Wilson was a kind of complex character in many ways, became an MP for them and was a long-standing principal in the SNP. But he did something that always struck me. I remember talking to him about it. As a forerunner of Independence Live Radio and Independence Live itself, which was Scotland, Radio Free Scotland. When the BBC had its bandwidth, it stopped at night and it finished with the national anthem, God Save the Queen. And the next thing you heard was Radio Free Scotland. They piggybacked onto the wavelength that the BBC had. That wasn't a speech, it wasn't a rally, it was just doing something which had a permanent feature and caused huge annoyance. That was Gordon Wilson. Small c conservative in many ways, but he was the guy that set that up and championed it. That's the type of things we need to be doing, looking at things that we can do to demonstrate not only that we believe we're sovereign, but show that we're sovereign.
I think a lot of people watching and listening tonight will probably agree with much of what you've just said, Mike. But it does raise an interesting conundrum, and it's this. The Scottish government, I suspect, might not warm to these ideas for the simple reason that they are perhaps set on a course that says, no, we need to act responsibly. We're a grown-up government. We're not into extracurricular activities. We want to stick to the knitting and convince people that we're reliable, we're a safe pair of hands, and we can't do that by indulging ourselves, even if we might agree personally with some of these ideas, maybe all of them, because it sort of reduces us in terms of the way we might be perceived. And you made the point earlier about international recognition. And maybe that's one of their concerns. I'm not in a position to speak for them, obviously, but do you think there might be a dichotomy here, that the government might be intrinsically supportive, but for all external purposes can't?
Let me try and answer that. Remember I said I started thinking very deeply way back at the beginning of the year. And I said that I had 2 reasons for including nuclear weapons in the declaration that I drew up. I have been doing letters to the Secretary General of the United Nations. And one of the things I've said is geopolitically, you might be interested in the views that come from Scotland on nuclear weapons. At the moment, John, the SNP and the Greens signed an agreement, as you know, is to pull the government together in a majority. And in that agreement, they state quite categorically that upon independence, they will seek to remove nuclear weapons from Scotland. You had Alba's conference at the weekend, who did similarly. I don't think Tommy Sheridan in Solidarity or ISP or AFI would want nuclear weapons in Scotland. So from that point of view, we have an open goal. If I want to support the views of all of those parties, I can do so. And that's why I'm starting a petition into Holyrood, which says I support you on these measures. And I'm going to ask you for a referendum to be held in Scotland so that everyone can have their views known. My instinct tells me that the majority would vote against nuclear weapons being harboured in Scotland. Now,
I think you're probably right there, Mike. But let me just pose another interesting.
I'm going to raise my own objections in a second, John. But fire ahead.
Well, and it's this. It's a fairly obvious one, and I'm sure you've heard it before. And that is, it ties in with your earlier remarks about the need for international recognition. The likelihood is, and it's not necessarily a
categorical
thing, but the likelihood is that the US may find that troublesome.
Absolutely.
And therefore, faced with a referendum result that says you need to remove the nuclear weapons as soon as we're independent, their reaction may be, well, I'll tell you what, I'm not going to remove the nuclear weapons, so therefore I'm going to come out against independence. Fixed, problem gone away. What would you do then?
My objection is I'm asking for a referendum in this petition. I haven't got round to it yet. There are rules I have to follow, John. I've covered the first one. Nicola Sturgeon has said you can't have a referendum in independence until after COVID has passed. So there would be no chance of having a referendum on nuclear weapons until COVID has passed. It's not going to come in advance of that. It would be a nonsense to think that. But if you've any knowledge of how the petition system works, once it's been approved and gone through the rules, it is laid open on the Scottish Parliament website for all and any comments that anyone wants to make, and for all and any signatures in advance of the thing being debated to be added to that. That's the gap I'm looking for, is to allow people to have their say on this issue. Yes, I'm asking for a referendum, but my knowledge of how the petition system works is you can actually have a referendum, depending on whether people... What I'm trying to do, John, is open doors.
I understand, Mike, and I applaud you, and I suspect many people watching and listening tonight will also applaud you, because they'll be saying nuclear weapons are an abomination and there shouldn't be any, least of all in Scotland. But I come back to the earlier point. We live in a world of realpolitik, as you know.
Yeah.
And I can imagine some of the hawks in Washington saying, well, we were actually neutral on Scottish independence. But now, looking at the situation now, we don't want to move this stuff right now. And if the price for leaving them there is to campaign or be active against independence, well, that's what we're going to do. So all of a sudden, we're confronted with the biggest guy in the block saying, I don't want anyone to support this idea. Isn't that going to temper the decisions taken at Holyrood?
I think you're going to have to face up to huge decisions at that level when Scotland aims for and regains its independence. We have to grow up in a very hostile world. I watched.
Sorry, Mike. Just to interrupt for a second. I think everyone would accept the point you've just made. However, the issue of which comes first is terribly important, it seems to me, and I'm still not sure how it gets resolved. If there's for example, if there's a vote in a referendum on independence, then a sovereign state, it doesn't matter what the US thinks, a sovereign state is a sovereign state, and there would have to be negotiations, etc. But if you tell people in advance that nuclear weapons are definitely going to go. I mean, I can't see any way around this, by the way. I'm raising it as a problem, but I can't see any way around it because it'll need some very deft diplomatic footwork. Because I can imagine the UK government representatives in Washington, D.C., whispering in Uncle Sam's ear, these nutters are going to get rid of that trident that you place such enormous stock in. Is this what you want to see happen? Or are you going to join with us in trying to make sure it doesn't happen?
Take it a different direction for a second, John, to try and answer your point. Mm-hmm. My intention was to try and get as many signatures to a potential referendum petition as I could. I'll sign it, I'll put the petition through. It's then up to the population of Scotland to decide to support it or not. But once that was done, my intention was to basically send two messages. First message is to Boris Johnson. And the second message is to the United Nations. Now, why those two messages? I'll start with the United Nations. In January of this year, after many years of discussion, they put forward a treaty. And that treaty is on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. I think about half of the United Nations members have so far ratified it, and it is increasing. Now, noticeable absentees from that will always be those states that have nuclear weapons. So we have the United Nations and a whole bundle of countries of similar size to Scotland, many of them, who are saying we're prohibiting nuclear weapons. Now, on the other hand, 2 months after that treaty was brought into light, Boris Johnson said, well, that's not for us. What we're going to do, we have 160 warheads at the moment. Let's increase it by 40% to 260. That's a nightmare. Boris Johnson is not meant to be threatening the rest of the world with annihilation because he's able to put those weapons in the fast lane. If you're not against that, you're not against very much. And if America object to that, I'm sorry, America. And let me try and explain why I say that. I watched Barack Obama the other night in a YouTube video, John. He was in Westminster Hall. He's the first American president ever to address Parliament in Westminster Hall. I can't remember the date of the video. It was about maybe 10 years ago. And he was announcing how successful he had been in defeating the Taliban completely in Afghanistan. Everyone could now look forward to a free Afghanistan, a democratic Afghanistan with kids going to school. I have nothing against Barack Obama. I'm quite sure he was very sincere. I wonder how he feels looking back now on that speech. I could go through Donald Trump and the fact that it's now been released that the chief of staff made sure he couldn't get hold of the nuclear weapon. Thank God for that, man, if that is true. There are going to be issues, a smaller scale, if you like, EU or EFTA, right, that Scotland is going to have to deal with. And the one thing for sure is that after we regain independence, the Scottish Parliament is going to be a different form of constituency than the one we have just now. It's SNP dominated because that was the party of independence. That's where your vote was going to go. After independence, I've said to you jokingly before, I think the day after independence, I'll just leave the country. Because if we think the arguments that are going on just now between everyone they're child's play to what's going to happen after we regain independence, John. But there's going to have to be statesmen involved in the Scottish Parliament who can deal diplomatically with the deft steps you're talking about. But ultimately, it's for the sovereign people of Scotland to decide whether it's a referendum, whether it's a plebiscite, whether it's UDI, whether it's nuclear weapons in Scotland. It's not for a politician to decide that. The politicians are servants of the sovereign people, John.
That's true. That's true. I was simply reflecting the realpolitik, but I'm going to make a suggestion that there may be a way around this. First of all, somebody somewhere needs to establish how critical it is for the US to have nuclear weapons in Scotland. Because it may turn out, because of technology, because of change in attitudes, change in prospective targets, if I can use that term loosely, that perhaps the location in Scotland is less strategically important to the US than perhaps it once was. And also, even if that remains to be the case, I suspect there's just as big a lobby in the United States in favour of climate change and preventing enormous climate change. And Scotland is in the forefront of that. So there might be a useful discussion that says, we're going to be your biggest supporter in preventing climate change in Europe. All we want from you, quid pro quo, is that you take these nasty things off our land.
I think you'll also find, John, the guy in charge of MI6 or MI5, a Scotsman, recently said that the largest threat to world peace will come from cyber attacks.
Yes.
There's a lot of discussion. I'm not expert enough in this, but there's a lot of discussion about cyber attacks going on in Scotland at the moment. There was a report about the influence that might have been played by Russia in the 2014 referendum. SEPA was recently hacked and held to ransom. There have been about 27 serious high-level attacks in Scotland. Biden recently called in the heads of the likes of Google, Amazon, Microsoft into the White House and said, look, you're all private companies. You're the mainstay of preventing cyber attacks. It's not the government is not in a position to deal with that. I would suggest to you that the nuclear warheads are all obviously a target for that. Now, I don't mean them in themselves. I'm hoping that they are not connected to the internet and can't be hacked in that way. But Fast Lane as a base, if SEPA can be shut down, I think it spent nearly £1 million trying to rebuild its whole system. What would stop, as happened in America, cutting off the electricity supply to Fast Lane, cutting off the communications to Fast Lane? It's not the warheads themselves, it's the fact that there are enemies out there. And I'm not sure that, if I can put it this way, the security problems that arise from these things are preventable. It's a bit like the Twin Towers being hit by 2 aeroplanes. No one had seen that coming.
I think you make some very interesting points.
Sorry if I digress too much. I should have warned you. I do it, John.
No, it's quite okay. Because it's a very interesting topic, and I suspect many people watching and listening are hugely interested in this because it affects everyone. Nuclear weapons, I said, are an abomination. Even the people who support them probably think they're an abomination. But the reality is that they're there because they satisfy some realpolitik maneuvering. But that maneuvering took place during the Cold War. And you've just made an excellent point about corruption of data. The attacks, if they are going to be attacks, are not going to come. They're not going to be prevented by a nuclear submarine wandering about undetected in the Atlantic Ocean for weeks and weeks at a time at a huge expense to all involved. They're going to come, as you say, through an email, perhaps, or they're going to come, dare I say it, in the form of a version of COVID. I mean, it's not going to come. Having nuclear weapons is not going to prevent either of those threats, one iota. And so therefore, as one looks to the future, and one hopes that planners and strategists are doing that, they must be coming to the conclusion. For example, I'd love to know to what degree of attachment the US still pays to having a Trident base. Now, maybe officially they say one thing, but I suspect behind the scenes they're probably thinking to themselves, how can we cut our losses here? Because it bears upon your points about Obama and Afghanistan. Joe Biden left because his predecessor said, we can't afford this anymore. And we're leaving. And he's got this huge new budget, Biden in the States, billions and billions of dollars. It doesn't make sense to be overextended across the world and be the world's policeman. when you can't afford to look after your own people at home. So interesting discussions might be possible amongst all these parties to see if something can be done that addresses everyone's needs in a way that would take the weapons out of Scotland and perhaps replace them with something more positive in the sense of helping to eliminate cybercrime or whatever.
Sometimes you just have to set an example.
Yeah.
I would have liked Scotland to, when you're talking about diplomacy and deft handling of it, beyond what I was trying to do with the idea of a petition and a referendum, would it not be possible to suggest, if we're looking at non-proliferation, that we actually start reducing them? I mean, they started in Russia and they started in America to reduce the stockpile. I think that's ended for the time being. And we've got North Korea going in the opposite direction. But setting an example of saying, look, it is possible, and invite America to say, exactly along the lines you're talking about, John, tell us why this is necessary. Because we don't want them here. Start having a dialogue with us.
Yeah.
And at that level of adult conversation, you are getting international recognition for what Scotland is and how Scotland feels. And that's long before, and this is what I'm trying to aim at, it's long before you've actually regained your independence. We're a mature, one of the oldest countries in the world. We've invented half of the world. And you telling me we can't have an adult conversation with other countries? It's a nonsense.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And of course, we can and we ought to. I wish you every success. Now, if people want to help you, what do they do? How can they get in touch with you, Mike? How can they support you? How do they do that?
The one I'd like to see pursued is the referendum, the petition on nuclear weapons, because I think we have the world arriving in Glasgow in COP26. I'd like to see people having signed up, if I can get it through the rules. I mean, I stress that I don't think there's any reason I shouldn't. I've got one qualification to chuck in at a slight thing. I worry about the composition of the petitions committee. And I won't make any further comment other than Jackson Carlaw is the convener of the petitions committee, which is why last week I delivered 71 letters to MSPs in the Parliament, 64 from the SNP, 7 from the Greens, so that they were aware beforehand that a petition was going in. And I'm hoping, given the background, that they all support the idea of getting rid of them, therefore doesn't hit an obstacle in the petitions committee.
Okay.
Once I can advise people I've got that far, then please comment. It's open to you to comment on the Parliament website, and it's open to you to sign up. That, I think. The other stuff that I'm doing, I tend to do it with Kevin's blessing at sometimes and curses other times. I tend to do live streams. I run a very small Facebook page, and it's from there you can look at the declaration and what it says, and whether or not I did it on the basis of Declaration 1, sending to the United Nations. The National picked up on it, and I'm using the links that they use to let people get connection to that. There's a lot more to come in this. I'm in stage 1 of that declaration. The idea of the referendum and the petition is part of that stage 1. There's more to come on other subjects. I'm going to get into currency. I'm going to get into pensions. There's a load of other things where my background, John, may allow me to say things in a particular way at different levels. One at very simple levels and one at higher levels. And maybe pair this conversation is you can start saying, simple question, are you in favour of nuclear weapons being in Scotland? And then you can go off at a tangent into whether there's cyber risk and how do you deal with it, exactly along the lines you said.
Well, there's a question that's come up from Charles Smith. And Charles is asking, without the threat of nukes, how does one contain the international school bully or lunatic?
It depends how you see that threat. It's meant to be a deterrent. I can understand if you decide to obliterate us, just be aware we're going to obliterate you. That strikes me, and it always has struck me, is a dead-end street. It's a cul-de-sac going nowhere, which is costing an awful, awful lot of money. 2, there are 195, I think it is, countries in the United Nations. I think 7 have nuclear weapons, which means that there are 180 odd completely defenseless, unable to do anything about all the bullies. What you got to do is join in with that lot and get rid of the nuclear weapons which the bullies are using to threaten you with. That takes you to realpolitik. I understand it's an easy way of, flip way of me just saying that, John. Realpolitik dictates it a different way. Let me do it this way. The regaining of, and this goes back to James Hawes, he was predicting that the future of England does not look particularly comfortable or easygoing if Scotland becomes the first breakaway from the UK. How would Russia think about England and Wales being on the Security Council? There's 5 permanent members, UK is 1. There wouldn't be a UK with Scotland in it. It would be England and Wales. How would China look on that? So you start having competing. China is going to be the dominant force in the next, beyond my lifetime. I'm quite sure about that. I'm not sure where America will fit in, but when you're talking about bullies and you're talking about realpolitik, John, you've got to look at what else is going on in the world. And I grew up with an American USAF base in Prestwick, where I was born, where I lived when I was younger. That's gone, and there's a retreat in America. I don't think that answers a person's question, but it's a good question. But
I think it probably does. And also it's worth adding, only one country has ever used nuclear weapons.
Yep.
You mentioned James Hawes again, and one of the questions I put to James, changing the subject a little bit, is why is there no right-wing nationalist party in Scotland? What's your take on that?
I love that question. Every show you say you've asked someone that question. You actually answered it. I know you were asking the questions, maybe you should be answering it, but you conflated unionism and conservatism. And that is where the right wing would be expected to come from. But you've got to split them apart, in my opinion, John. There was a time in my lifetime when conservatives were getting quite a few votes in Scotland. Possibly as a result of the war just ending, possibly as a result of generations and generations changing. But basically, conservatives like the status quo. They've a huge, huge fear of uncertainty. If you start confusing them, right? So you've got conservatives in Scotland at the moment, where if you put it together with unionism, doesn't allow them to come out because they're on the unionist side of it. Well, we can't have the uncertainty, so we've got to retain the union. The best thing
that would only apply, really, Mike, if what they wanted to stay united to. This is the matter we covered with James. That only makes sense if what you want to remain united to actually makes any sense. I mean, it maybe doesn't even have the same form that you thought it might have had. So therefore, you're united to what? And I think the point and the question I've put to every single person who's been on the show from the centre right is the same question. I get the same answer. They say, well, it's because the SNP is such a broad church that it encompasses all points of view.
I slightly disagree with that, John. Look, I'll do it this way. You've got GB News is a right-wing broadcaster. Yes? Okay. It's having problems. People in Scotland who are currently, I'm not going to call them right-wing, I'm going to call them conservative. I'm going to split the unionists and the conservatives. Those that remain in Scotland have as much responsibility for ensuring the stability, the prosperity of everyone in Scotland as anyone who is known as left-wing. It's not something, I think you'll see things develop after we regain independence. That's why I said I'd leave the country, because we're going to have a real stramash. But it's not going to be right wing per se. I think I'm sitting on the edge of a pin when I say this. You've got to define what you mean by right wing before you can answer that question, because I think there's two parts to it. One is silent at the moment and will speak. The other one, right wing, I don't see a place for any radical right wing political party in Scotland after independence.
You don't see the place for a right wing party after independence?
Not radical right wing.
Well, even if that were the case, and I think I would hesitate to accept that, but even if that were the case, it still doesn't explain why Scotland uniquely does not have a right-wing nationalist party. Because if everyone else in the world feels that this is essential, how come the Scots have decided, no, it's not for us? And why?
I'm sorry, I've completely failed to answer it then, John. And I just had my own view.
But okay. It's to me it remains interesting. You may recall James's answer was I thought rather interesting. He said, "Well, that's because there's no tradition in Scotland of empire. You become a right-wing nationalist because you want to hold on to what remains of empire. That's what drives you. If you're trying to become independent in a country like Scotland, you have no longing for that which was in the sense of empire, which takes you down a right-wing route." I respect James enormously. I didn't find that wholly convincing, but at least it was different.
Well, all I can say is long may your show continue, and long may you have the ability to ask the question. I just hope you get an answer, John.
I'll keep on asking. I've got we've got the UK's foremost philosopher coming on in a few weeks' time in October, and I'll be asking him that question, AC Grayling. A question that cropped up earlier, and I think you might want to take a view on this, it really is, it's from Robert Knight, and he's saying, why not? We encourage all questions here. He says, "I'm looking for any tips, please, on how to invest ethically in Scotland."
Okay, that'll get me into trouble.
Oh, don't answer it then.
No. I used to work very, very long hours, John. And I mean, really, 7 days a week, 24, not quite 24 hours, but sometimes 20 hours up and down to London, etc. There was one Sunday night, I was working late and I went out and bought myself a pie supper and the Sunday Times. And the Sunday Times had a competition in it. It's called an investment competition. And as I munched my way through my pie supper, I entered the investment competition. And I don't know this is true, but I think I'm one of the few people in Scotland ever to have won a Sunday Times investment competition. As a result of which, I became known for giving investment advice. I retired from giving investment advice, and I retired very successfully from giving investment advice. So I apologize, Mr. Robert Knight, but what you raise is a very interesting question. Too often, you'll be looking at markets and shares in markets. And what you should be looking at is social enterprises who don't have stocks and shares, people who are doing things where the profits are reinvested into whatever the enterprise is. So if you're actually look for people in Scotland who are currently doing work on the land, whatever it happens to be, support them, because that is what we need, is the land put to better use.
I think again, everyone would pretty much agree with that. And personally, I would like to feel that as we move towards independence, and certainly after independence, Scotland might be seen as one of these places because of its approach, the values that predicate the culture here, might be seen as a very useful place to invest ethical funds, because I suspect, and I rather hope, that an independent Scotland might take a different view of what business enterprises ought to be. And right now we've got this rather odd legal situation where businesses are responsible only really officially, legally to their owners, and they don't need necessarily to involve other stakeholders, and some of them just decline to do so categorically. Others take a more enlightened view, but strictly speaking, legally, in fact, you could argue that it's irresponsible to take on board the views of people who aren't your owners, because they literally own you.
Do not believe any chairman or CEO of a corporate entity of any size who says that they are socially responsible. It is a complete antithesis of what he's there to do. You've got to find out. When I sold the companies that I ran, John, I had a Damascus moment, if you like. I spent my life helping people who are rich to get richer, helping a lot of other people as well, straightforward, ordinary people. But that in the main, until I had a moment in a chemist client where we were investing money to get him tax relief of 60% on his income. His income was derived from a place in Pollock. 15% of his income came from perfume or elastoplast. The other 85% came from dispensing methadone. And I sat down and said, Mike, sell the companies, start going into social enterprise. There's a body called Scot. I've not been actively involved for a long, long time. But it's a social enterprise network in Scotland. And I was one of the 3 people that tried to kick that into being. It's now moved on to other things. But we have to find ways of producing profit and producing income for Scotland, which comes from social enterprise and which does not disappear over the border.
Okay, I think that makes sense. I want to take you back, if I may, because we don't have a lot of time left. We've got about 8 minutes, Mike. You mentioned the United Nations, and you were kind enough to send me the 3 essential chapters from the General Assembly Resolution 1514 of the 14th December 1960.
Yep.
And item 2 says, all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, which sounds very much like what you've been describing. However, the 3rd clause says, any attempt aimed at the partial or total disruption of the national unity and territorial integrity of a country is incompatible with the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. How do you, I mean, you're not the United Nations, so you don't have to answer this question, but I'd be interested to how United Nations squares these 2 things.
Okay. At the age of 17, I was sent on a course, and it's one of the 3 main mentors I had in my life. And he got me to read. This will sound like a digression, but it comes back to the point you're asking. He got me to read an insurance policy of about 10,000 words, and he said, I want you to find the most important word. It applied to a farm. And as you watch a farmer put haystacks in the field, they're all separate. And they can spontaneously combust. Heat can be generated. And this fire insurance policy said, excluding its own spontaneous fermentation, which meant if you had, 100 hay bales out in the field, 1 went in fire, that was fine, but the other 99 were still insured. But what he taught me was that word, its own, its, I-T-S. He said, what does the farmer do with all those hay bales, Mike? I said, he puts them in a Dutch barn. And that is suddenly it. So if the 1 wee bit still goes in fire, nothing is insured any longer. I got taught that at the age of 17, John, and I've used it time after. I've often been told I should have been a lawyer. When you read the 3 paragraphs that you've just referred to, look for 3 different words: country, states, and people. And it's only when you interpret those 3 words accurately that you can actually get the basic meaning of where they flow with. Essentially, it's down to, look, if you're a state, you're signed up to this declaration. You're responsible for making sure this happens. You mustn't be interfering with people who have the right to self-determination. And the one thing you mustn't be doing is manipulating how they're getting on in their country. And it's the three different words that make the difference, John. I hope that explains it. It's how I interpret it.
Okay. We'll indulge Charles Smith because he's got another question. And I think you might like this one. If you could amend the Companies Act, what change would you choose to make?
I'd go even further than that. I'd go back to 1855 when the Limited Liability Act was passed. It's a bit of a misleading thing that. I'll come up to 1970. No, I won't. I'll start with Robert Burns. I wrote an article about Orkney News. Have published it. If you go to Orkney News, you should find it. And it was about the Air Bank. And the Air Bank in Robert Burns' time went bust. And it cost everyone that had put money into the Air Bank, whether they were shareholders or depositors, a bundle of money. Up till 1970-71, companies like Goldman Sachs, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, all those big companies had to be partnerships. They had to put their own money in, and if it all went wrong, they lost everything, absolutely everything. Because of lobbying, they, in 1971, were allowed to establish themselves as limited liability companies. 2008 comes along, Lehman Brothers disappears. But who picks up all the debts? It didn't disappear owing no one anything. It owed a lot of people through derivatives. The public did. There is nothing to stop people sitting down and saying, should we allow banks to be in that position? If you think of Fred Goodwin, should Fred Goodwin be allowed, and I'm against him personally, but should he be allowed to enjoy the benefits of 30 years of people putting money into the Royal Bank and not suffer the consequences of the fact that he let it go bust? Because there's a lady in Shettleston who's about to lose her universal credit who was asked to pay and is continuing to pay Fred Goodwin's pension. There's a lot to do with, I'll give you an easy example, John, and I'll finish in this if I may. The current minimum wage, I think this figure is right, the current minimum wage is £8.91 per hour. I want you to think of the hours in the day. There's 24 hours in the day. The commodity used is hours. Ignore the 891 for a second. There's someone having to work for 891 if they're lucky, if they're above 23. Many hours does Jeff Bezos have? How much does he get paid per hour? If you ever want to find out about inequality and the real cause of it, and I'm not a socialist or a capitalist, all I am is a realist in many ways, you've got to look at what it is we're talking about. Currency isn't the problem for Scotland. Currency is an easy thing to solve. We've seen it done by Estonia, everyone else. Stop talking about currency. Talk about how you regulate the markets. Talk about how you stop people getting too much money from too poor people. Start changing the way that structure goes. Scotland used to be famous. I once wrote an article called Promises, Promises. And I addressed it and got the help from Scottish Amicable, Standard Life, Scottish Widows, Scottish Provident. Can't remember the other companies. There were 9 ASLO offices, John. All mutual, all run for hundreds of years, very successfully. All privatized, taken over. Why? Because the big money people said we can gobble up public money, the public's money from that. So companies, sorry if I'm not maybe answering it directly, but I hope where I'm heading with the arguments point a direction that we should be looking at in Scotland.
I think that makes a lot of sense, I have to say. Well, we have almost run out of time, Mike. A big thank you to you because I'm sure everyone will agree with me. It's been fascinating, and people know how to get in touch with you. so that if they want to, they can take this forward. So a big thank you to Mike. It's been enlightening, and a big thank you to all of you out there for watching and listening and joining us tonight. I do hope you've enjoyed the show. As ever, we've got a formidable lineup of guests for future shows. I mentioned Professor A.C. Grayling. This is the place for the big hitters. And remember, India Live and the What's On guide, you can go there anytime and you can spec out what's happening for future shows, etc. And we're back next week with our special guest. We hope to have Professor Ian Black with us next week. As always, a reminder, do look out for my Constitution column in the Sunday National this weekend. You'll find it in the supplement, the 7-day supplement. And if you like it, tell the editor. If you don't like it, tell me. What we'll be talking about this week is a comment made by the head of the BBC today, in which he says he has set the BBC on a journey to impartiality, which rather suggests that impartiality may be a future goal that they tend to try and reach for. That's a bit of a disappointment, since we all thought up until now that they were impartial. Then again, we learn something new every day. Thanks again. Please join us next Wednesday. And remember, please, it's been a great day for British democracy. We hear that the truly incompetent Education Secretary for England, Gavin Williamson, has been sacked, and Michael Gove is moving. So it's a bit like watching someone rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. To all of you, thanks for joining us. Please stay safe and take care. Good night, all.